So Ted Cruz made some comments to Bloomberg News that raised my eyebrows a little bit because he's using an interesting and unexpected political strategy. So when it comes to Ted Cruz, I've maintained for a very long time he's a smarmy asshole, which is obvious, but also that he's so insanely far right that his base is the few remaining Rush Limbaugh listeners in the country, the Mark Levin listeners, the Sean Hannity people. Like, that's his crowd. And that crowd, while they carry some sway in the Republican Party, is that going to be enough to bring a guy like Ted Cruz the nomination? No. And that's part of the reason why. The other reason why is that he's so fake that, you know, if you have any sense in your head, you could look at him and go, oh my God, the entire thing is an act. He's an actor. That's what he's doing. But I may have underestimated him because he's using a really interesting tactic that could be successful. So on the issue of foreign policy, he said the following, quote, Senator Rubio emphatically supported Hillary Clinton in toppling Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. I think that made no sense. Gaddafi was a bad man. He had a horrible human rights record. And yet, he had become a significant ally in fighting radical Islamic terrorism. The terrorist attack that occurred in Benghazi was a direct result of that massive foreign policy blunder. If you look at President Obama and Hillary Clinton, and for that matter, some of the more aggressive Washington neocons, they have consistently misperceived the threat of radical Islamic terrorism and have advanced military adventurism that has had the effect of benefiting radical Islamic terrorists. In Syria, arming the so-called moderate rebels, I think none of that makes any sense. In my view, we have no dog in the fight of the Syrian civil war. We are repeating the very same mistakes they made in Libya. They've demonstrated they've learned nothing. The enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. If the Obama administration and the Washington neocons succeed in toppling Bashar Assad, Syria will be handed over to radical Islamic terrorists. ISIS will rule Syria. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, what the fuck was that? Where'd that come from? That does not sound like something Ted Cruz would ever say. And you wouldn't be wrong, at this point at least, to assume, is Ted Cruz like a non-interventionist? Is he with Rand Paul? Wrong, that's not true. Hold on here. Bloomberg goes on to explain, quote, the Texan portrayed himself as a third way between the stalwart non-interventionist views of Senator Rand Paul and pro-interventionist policies. Oh, I see what he's doing here. That is a fascinating strategy for a Republican primary. And it might work. Now, again, I may have underestimated Ted Cruz because when you look at the polls, he's in the top 4 or so in most of the polls. So he's a sleeper. He's a sleeper. He's hanging back there. Now, the appeal of Trump and Ben Carson right now is that they are so anti-establishment in the tone that they strike and the things that they say, that people are like, anything that's not establishment right now, I will take. But historically, this is the time in the primary season where the people who don't win end up leading. Is it possible Trump wins? Yes, in fact, I think he is the front runner, not just on paper, but in reality, it's his race to lose. But there are people who are sleepers. I've said before, somebody like Marco Rubio is the establishment fallback. Granted, he's a classic politician, but when push comes to shove and the Republican base goes into the voting booth, what do they usually do? Well, with John McCain, they went with the establishment fallback. With Mitt Romney, they went with the establishment fallback. Marco Rubio may be that today. But I originally put Ted Cruz in the category of the Rick Santorums and the Mike Huckabees, where he's far too extreme and far too right-wing to get people in the base on his side. But when you come out and you make an argument like this, I think it's a fantastic political strategy to use in a Republican primary. So there is, a war hawk element that is the base of the Republican Party. But when you look at polls overall, for example, with Afghanistan, only 17% of the American people still wanted to be in there. It's a majority of Republicans who are like, okay, enough, I'm tapping out on that one too. Syria. Nobody in the U.S. wants to be involved in Syria. Nobody. I mean, again, we covered the polls on that. Something in the teens. So that's a majority of Republicans as well. So there's also a strong percentage of the base of the Republican Party that on this particular issue, they're not, hey, bomb everything and ask questions later. And perhaps they're not solely on the side of Rand Paul, where I would agree, where he's just like, look, only use violence for self-defense. So they're somewhere in the middle there. And here comes Ted Cruz with his, I'm somewhere in the middle on this too. And also, let's just note the contradiction in here. He's arguing for mild intervention / mild U.S. imperialism, where, oh, yeah, these places here, we should probably stay out, maybe not, because other comments he's made have hinted to the opposite of that. But where does that put him on the spectrum? That actually puts him directly with Hillary Clinton and President Obama. President Obama said in his State of the Union speeches, it's not a question of if America will lead the world, it's a question of how we lead the world, and he rebukes the stupid moves of the neocons where you literally ground invade in the Middle East and you occupy and you have hundreds of thousands of troops. Obama says, that's what I don't like. But hey, drone strikes nonstop, airstrikes nonstop, maybe some special forces. They're not boots on the ground, even though they're literally boots on the ground, but special forces here and there. Advisors, military advisors here and there. Well, there's your soft imperialism, your soft intervention, your middle ground. That's what Obama represents. And Ted Cruz, in classic Ted Cruz fashion, disregards that and he says, no. I'm not with Hillary Clinton. I'm not with Obama. But I'm also not with the other Republicans who, like Marco Rubio, who seemingly wants to do even more intervention in terms of ground invade and high troop levels on the ground and stuff like that. I'm not with any of them. I'm my own man. I'm the middle ground, and that's why you should vote for me. I think it's a good strategy. Now, the only thing is, he runs into the brick wall a little bit of Donald Trump here, because Donald Trump always speaks off the cuff, and he's actually managed to say some reasonable things on foreign policy just because he's shooting from the hip. So, in Syria, for example, he says, yeah, Vladimir Putin's bombing ISIS. So what? Let him. I like that. That's something I hear that. I'm like, that actually makes sense. Why should we have to fight everybody? Let Russia fight people. The Republican base also was like, yeah, why not? Now, that's not something you'd ever hear Jeb Bush say. That's not something you'd ever hear any of the other Republicans say. But Ted Cruz is showing maybe, he's listening. He's like, okay, how can I find the political middle ground on this? And he may be a calculating politician who has a better shot than I originally said. And that's a very scary thing. Because with Ted Cruz, you get the sense that everything he says is an act. It's on the surface. And you have no clue what he would really do if elected. And my gut says what he would really do ain't pretty.